Well, welcome back to another session of our Building a Healthy Home series. And today we're going to continue building that structure that we've been telling you all about. We started in the foundation with a spiritual foundation, and then the two walls of trust and commitment. And then we had the preparation for marriage. We talked about the first floor of the home, so to speak, preparation for marriage, and then nurturing the family, and then yet we talked about nurturing intimacy. Now we're on the second floor. If you're building that same diagram, protecting intimacy. And in order to protect intimacy, we need to learn how to handle conflict, because conflict happens in every relationship. Sometimes people think that if we have conflict, we're having serious problems. We probably are heading to the divorce court or something like that. No, conflict happens in every relationship. It's just a matter of knowing how to manage it in a constructive and a positive way. And in fact, notice that we use the word manage it, not necessarily resolve it, because some conflict we may just simply not be able to resolve. One of the most influential psychologists in the 20th century, his name is John Gottman. He says that some couples may have some conflict that they may never resolve, but they still may have a very good, successful marriage. And the same thing goes for family. We may have some conflict that we may never be able to resolve, but we can still have a good family relationship. I'll give you an example. My wife and I are both very clean, orderly, organized people. Our daughters, I don't know who raised our daughters, because they just don't like to keep their rooms clean. Well, as they were growing up, we had this ongoing conflict. We wanted them to keep their room clean. They just didn't seem interested in keeping their room clean. So we had to decide, do we want to have a good relationship with them, or do we want to have a clean room but no relationship? So we decided what's most important is a good relationship. And the agreement that we came to was, your room is your room. You can do whatever you want with it there, but just keep the door closed so we don't have to see that mess. But the rest of the house, that's our house, you have to keep it clean. And well, we managed that. We never had any problems with that. To this day, we don't have problems with that. We go to their homes. If their home is upside down, that's their home. But when they come to our house, they have to help keep it clean. So it's a way to manage conflict in a constructive way, in a positive way, instead of having to argue all the time and destroy the relationship.
Ephesians 4 verse 26 says, be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. So even the Bible acknowledges that there are times you're going to have conflict. It says, be angry, but do not sin.
Absolutely. In general terms, there are four possible responses to conflict. The most logical one is, I win, you lose.
Oh, I like the one. Actually, I don't like the second one. You win, I lose. I like what you said before, where I win.
Well, it's the same thing. I win, you lose, and you say you lose.
You win, I lose. That one's not so fun, is it?
No, we don't want to have to be the one to lose. And it doesn't mean that we always have to win, but we surely don't want to be the ones to lose all the time either. Of course, there's a third option, which is where we both lose. And that happens in many relationships where they finally say, we're done with this, and we go our separate ways. And of course, that means, again, divorce court and even more conflict. And then you have to have a visitation fights and finances and all kinds of things. And by the way, some people say, well, at least I'm divorced. I never have to see my spouse again. Well, what about your children's graduations and their weddings? And then when you have grandchildren, you think you're never going to see your spouse again or ex-spouse again? You're going to have them for the rest of your life. Would it be better to have some positive way to resolve our conflict now and stay together instead of a fight for the rest of our life? So I win, you lose. I lose, you win. We both lose. Or the fourth option, which is
everyone wins and no one loses.
Absolutely.
And that's where we work out a compromise that we both can live with, that we're both happy with. That's the goal, isn't it?
That's ultimately the goal. That's what we want to see happen. Again, there may be some conflict and we don't always get our way, but at least we have managed it in a positive way.
So we're going to talk about some principles of constructive conflict, some constructive ways of managing conflict. Number one, practice the prevention rule. You know, Proverbs 17, verse 14 says, the beginning of strife is like the letting of water. Stop the flow before it starts. Quit before the quarrel breaks out. So certainly if we can prevent it in the first place, that's optimal.
Yes, it's kind of like the dam that has that little hole. Well, you plug the hole as soon as possible before the water continues to make that hole bigger and bigger, and then the dam collapses. So prevent, what is it that they say? An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure.
Yes.
There you go. So prevent it. Now, it doesn't mean that you keep your mouth shut all the time. You know, you're burning inside, you're hurting inside. I'm just gonna not saying a thing. No, but there are sometimes better ways of handling, or there are times when it may be better to just not get involved in it. Don't escalate into a bigger conflict, because once you begin, the evolution of the conflict is incredibly hard to shut down. Once you begin that argument, and then you start throwing accusations one way and the other, and sometimes offensive comments, by then it may be too late.
Sometimes it's hard to take back what you've already said.
If you can.
Right.
Yeah.
So number two, look for areas where you are to blame. That's difficult sometimes. It would have been easier if I would have said, look for areas where he is to blame or the other person is to blame. But it's hard to really stop and ask myself the question, could I be at fault here?
And so in order to do that, what we recommend is that you ask yourself, don't ask the other person, but ask yourself some questions. For instance, is it a worthy battle? I'll give you a quick example. One time when I was a pastor in a church, a couple asked for my visit because they were facing some marital difficulties. So when I got there, I knocked on the door, the lady of the house opened the door, and I could tell she was already upset, which makes you very uncomfortable. You don't know what kind of fight they just had, and I'm in the middle of it. Husband too was also very upset. Pastor, come in, have a seat. I mean, it was just cut and dry. And just as I sat down, they said, Pastor, you need to help us solve this situation because we're about to break up and get a divorce because we're sick and tired of fighting over this. So you need to give us the answer. Should the toilet paper roll over or under? I thought it was a joke at first, but then I could tell they were not. They have been arguing over this for who knows how long, because she felt that the toilet paper should roll over and he felt that it should roll under. And whenever one of them used the restroom, they would flip the toilet paper, and then the other person would come and get very angry and flip it over again. Is that really a worthy battle? Is it worth fighting over toilet paper?
Is it worth ruining your family over the toilet paper goes over or under?
It just doesn't make sense. Proverbs 19:11 says, those with good sense are slow to anger, and it is their glory to overlook an offense. So think, okay, is this really worth fighting over? Is it really that important that I'm going to die on that hill? Another question that you should ask yourself, and I think we mentioned it just a little while ago, am I wrong? Is it possible that this whole thing is my fault? Instead of just defending it and fighting through it because I gotta win, maybe I should stop to think, am I wrong? Maybe I'm the one that's making a big deal out of this.
And here's another question. What difference is this going to make in my life in 3 days? Or what impact will it have in 5 years? In other words, is this really worth arguing over? And long term, as I think back over my life or think back over this issue, is it really that important? That's a good one to help us actually stop and put it all in perspective.
When you think about this story that I just told you, imagine if they had thought to themselves, what difference is this going to make in my life in 3 days? I'm going to have to change the toilet paper anyways. So I just let it run as it is, and then I'll change it. I'll put it wherever it is. But what really matters is that there is toilet paper.
That's
You know,
right.
during the pandemic, when there was this panicky buying of toilet paper, at least we have toilet paper. What difference does it make if you put it one way or the other? And what impact will it have in 5 years? In 5 years, hopefully we will still have toilet paper. But what if we argue over this and it ends our marriage? Is it really that important to us that we're willing to let it do it?
Here are another few suggestions and principles to keep in mind as you have conversations with each other. First of all, use the still, small voice. You know, instead of screaming or yelling, it's amazing how much more can actually be heard and how much more can be communicated if you just stop. If you just stop, speak slowly and still, very quietly.
I learned that from Pam as she was teaching a class of first, second, and third graders and how rambunctious sometimes they could be. But as she lowers her voice, the volume of the kid's voice also came down. And guess what? Things also began to come down. We have the opposite tendency. We raise our voice because we want to be heard and we want to be the ones to say the last word. But because you do that, it just simply escalates instead of bringing the temperature down, bringing the volume down some.
Because actually the other person will try to match your voice and tone. So if I'm screaming and yelling, there's a natural inclination for the other person to do the same. Whereas if I use the still small voice, imagine if you both mirror that type.
And the reality is that no one listens when you're shouting. And so you can shout as loud as you can or want to, but the other person has already stopped listening anyway. So what's the point? Here's something that we have found to be valuable and important. And it's to maintain your sense of humor. Sometimes we get upset. Something happened and we react. But when we stop to think about it, it was so silly. Sometimes we end up laughing about the whole thing, that it was just so silly that it even started, or that we let it go that way. So maintain your sense of humor. When I was a marriage and family therapist in Virginia, I remember a couple that came to my office and they were telling me how they learned to manage their conflict. They said that when they were arguing, they had come to an agreement. They put a floor mat in the kitchen, and they said when they were arguing, suddenly one of them would take off running and hit the mat, because whoever hit the mat first won. And so they were actually running to get there first, and then they ended up laughing at the whole thing. So they turned it into a game of sorts. Why argue when we can laugh? So try to maintain your sense of humor. Now, it doesn't mean that you laugh at the other person, that you make fun at the other person, but rather that you look at yourself and think, well, this is so silly, and laugh at yourselves in order to maintain a healthy relationship and a healthy atmosphere.
Another thing to remember is don't get personal. Don't point the finger, don't call names. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute, but to realize I may be frustrated at the situation, but I still love the person. I'm not going to point fingers and call names at the person or say, you made me, but to keep that all in perspective, don't get personal.
Yes, don't say irresponsible things. I heard a story of a rabbi that someone had said very mean things to him, and actually about him as well. And when the person actually came to confess, he said, let me show you this. And he pulled a feather pillow and he opened it and spread the feathers out in the air. And it was a windy day, so of course the feathers were all over, literally. And then the rabbi said to the person, go pick them all up. And of course, the person said, that's impossible. They're scattered all over the place. And he said, well, that's what happens when you say things about other people to attack them and to hurt them. You can't bring them back. You may be able to recall some of them, but they spread so fast and so wide that it's very difficult, if possible, to bring them back. So be careful what you say. Don't say things that are mean, that are rude, that are unkind, because once they're out of your lips, you can't bring them back.
Another thing to keep in mind, don't bring up the past. That doesn't help. You know, sometimes we like to keep what I call a laundry list. And I'm going to write down everything you've done wrong, every time you've hurt me. And so when we have the next argument or the next disagreement, I'm going to bring up my list. And I'm just going to say, and while we're at it, you know, and just read through the list of things I've made. That doesn't help. That doesn't help solve anything. When you bring up too many things, you're not going to solve even one thing. So don't be tempted to bring up the past.
And kind of similar to that, don't change the subject. Don't get off the subject. If we're going to sit to talk about this one thing that we're dealing with, don't talk about that other thing and that other thing and this other thing. Let's just talk and stick to this one area and see if we can find a way to manage it, to compromise if we have to, whatever we need to do just for this one area. Sometimes that's where couples or families never get anywhere, because instead of dealing with one, they're trying to deal with all of them, and they never reach any kind of workable solution. So stick to the subject. Don't get off that subject.
And avoid statements that are impossible to defend. We need to be careful of our language. Sometimes we say things that really aren't even true. And when asked to prove it, you know, prove that what you said is true, we can't. And we do that by the language that we use.
For instance, you know, I ask you to pick up the kid at school, or get some bread at the grocery store or something like that. No, you didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, I did. Well, I mean, how do you defend that unless you have some sort of recording that says, let me just play it? But even then, how would that solve the situation? So we encourage you to avoid 6 fatal phrases that we sometimes use. One of them we use very often. You always. Always? Is it really always? I mean, every single time they open their mouth, they always do this, or they always say this. What happened before you met? That's also part of the always. So can that really be true and accurate?
It can't be defended. And the opposite of that is you never. So to say you always do something or you never do something, well, maybe there was one time I did. So there again, it puts you in a very difficult situation to prove that your statement is true.
Yeah. Another expression that we use sometimes is you should, or you could have, you should have, you could have. Can you turn the clock back? So what's the point of saying you should have done this? You could have done that. Okay, yes, I could have. Yes, I should have. The fact is that I didn't. How can I change that when I already did it? So it just doesn't change things by trying to turn the clock back.
So very similar to saying you should have or you could have is saying, why didn't you? You know, why didn't you do that? Well, obviously they did it. So that doesn't help to manage the conflict, you know, talking about hypothetical situations. Why didn't you? Well, it's kind of too late for that, isn't it?
Here's another one that sometimes we use. I would have, because then I am lifting myself up above you to show you that I am wiser, that I'm better, that I'm smarter. Basically, I'm being very arrogant, assuming that I know better because I would have.
Or this one, you make me. There again, no one makes you. You have a choice of your own feelings and your own behavior. So to say, you make me, you're giving somebody else responsibility that isn't even theirs. It's your responsibility, your own feelings, your own responses to things, that's yours.
So instead of trying to rewind and go back to the past where you just can't change the past anyways, you can make changes in the future. So maybe you can replace those phrases that we just mentioned with some other phrases like in the future. For instance, in the future, if you're going to be late, can you please give me a call so I don't worry about you? You know, so I'm not accusing you of anything that you did in the past. You don't say you're always late, you never call me, but rather in the future, can you please do this?
Or here's another one, next time. You know, you're not going back and changing something you can't, but you're saying next time. Next time, would you please leave my keys on my desk and not in the car? See, you're giving them the opportunity to change the future. They can't change the past.
Here's another one, and actually this is a good way to handle it with young people, kids, teenagers. What would have to happen? Then obviously you finish the sentence. So for instance, what would have to happen for you to be more helpful around the house, or for you to clean the room, or what would have to happen for you to help me with the children? You know, so you're allowing the other person, giving the other person, inviting the other person to provide their own possible solution, their own answer, so to speak.
You're opening it up to a compromise. You're opening it up to it's an open-ended question to a conversation. And that's helpful.
Right. So again, keep in mind that what we're talking about is managing conflict in a constructive way, not avoiding it, because avoiding conflict is actually worse. It may fester inside you like a poison, like an infection, and one day it'll explode, maybe in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there are more serious consequences. So see what you can do to manage conflict in a more positive way. But even as you manage conflict, as you try to do your best, there are times when we fail. We're human beings and we say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and we hurt our spouse, we hurt our children, we hurt those closest to us. Again, we can just simply ignore it. We can just simply say, hey, fine, it's over, let's move on. Or we can forgive. But we need to understand what forgiveness is, because if we don't understand what it is, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that forgiveness is something that actually is not. So we need to learn to forgive. That's part of that protecting the intimacy of the family that we've been talking about. Jesus did say in Matthew chapter 6, verse 15, if you don't forgive others, neither will my Father forgive your trespasses. So it's a very important thing that God wants for us, that Jesus wants for us. It's not just simply, well, I just want you to get along better, but hey, if you don't forgive, my Father can't forgive you either. Now, there are three categories of forgiveness in general terms, obviously. One, what is called detached forgiveness, where there is a reduction in the negative feelings toward the other person, but there's no reconciliation. You know, you're there, I'm here. Yes, I forgive you, but we're not relating here. And by the way, as you're going to see in a few minutes, forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. We can't say, well, because you forgive, you also must be reconciled. There are situations or circumstances where there's no reconciliation. Maybe it's something that was done to us in the past and that person has passed on, has died. Well, how can we be reconciled? Or, as we mentioned in a previous session, what if there is abuse and the victim leaves an abusive situation? You can't say, well, you need to forgive your spouse and be reconciled, because you're putting that person back into an abusive relationship. So forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Again, we'll see that. So in some cases, you can forgive, but you maintain your distance. That's what we mean by detached forgiveness.
There's also limited forgiveness, and that's the situation where there is a reduction in the negative feelings I may have towards the offender, but the relationship is only partially restored. Even though there's a decrease in the emotional intensity of the relationship, I'm still forgiving them. I'm still letting go of the past, but I'm not completely opening myself up to a full restoration of the relationship.
And then, of course, there's full forgiveness, and that's where there is a cessation of negative feelings. You don't feel negative feelings. In other words, you don't experience negative feelings toward the other person. You have actually not only extended the forgiveness, you have made the decision to forgive them, but you actually feel good toward them, maybe even love toward them. And it's almost as if nothing had happened. You have been healed of the wounds that have been caused by the other person. Obviously, that's the ideal, but it doesn't always happen, and it's not required in all situations. And that's what we're trying to explain here. And part of the reason, again, why we sometimes have a difficult time with forgiveness is that we don't understand what forgiveness is. And in order to understand what forgiveness is, I think we need to understand what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not approval of what the other person did. You know, for instance, someone stole from your checking account all the money that was there. Well, once they're caught, they're arrested, they're caught, they're sent to jail, you can forgive them, but it doesn't mean that you say, well, that's okay. They probably needed the money. Let them have it. No, that's not what forgiveness is. Now, you can decide to do that. You could say, yes, I don't need the money. I'm so rich, I don't care for that money. Or maybe I'm so poor, I don't care. It wasn't that much money. That's a decision that you make. But that's not what forgiveness is. You can't approve something that was wrong, something that was done to you that was wrong. You can't just simply approve it.
Forgiveness is also not excusing or justifying. You can't say they did it because, they only made the mistake because. There's no justification for wrong, and there's no excusing it. So when you try to make it excused, that doesn't mean that you've forgiven them. It's not what forgiveness is.
They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't mean it. You know, those kinds of things, we're just excusing what the other person was doing.
They were angry. They did it because they were angry.
Yeah. You know, and again, there are situations where, you know, I remember reading a story of a little boy that stole some bread from a baker or a bakery. And you could say, well, that poor child was hungry. And in fact, didn't even eat the bread himself. He took it to his home to feed his brothers because his parents had died. Well, that's a sad story, but it doesn't excuse the fact that he stole. You could extend grace and say, well, let's see how we can help that child and his siblings, but you still don't excuse the action. So that's what we're trying to help you understand, that again, forgiveness is not just simply excusing a wrongdoing. In the same way, forgiveness is not pardoning what the other person did. You see, a pardon is kind of a legal dictate, a legal decision that is made. So for instance, I'll give you a story, a true story, actually, a very sad story that happened in the 90s, I remember, and here in the United States, actually in the 80s, going back a little farther back. There was a young lady who was walking, hitchhiking on a road in California, and a truck driver stopped to give her a ride. So she climbed on the truck, but instead of continuing on the main road, the truck driver pulled off onto a side road, a small country road, where he proceeded to rape this young girl, and she was only like 16 years old. And not only did he rape her, but then with a chainsaw, he cut her arms off and left her to bleed to death. And he took off. But she didn't bleed to death. Actually, she got up, walked to the nearest road, and imagine trying to wave arms that were not there anymore. People were not even stopping. They were horrorized with the scene. But finally, someone did stop, picked her up, took her to the hospital, and she survived miraculously. She described the man. He was arrested and sent to jail. And some people would say to her, have you forgiven him? And she said, yes, I have, because I don't want to be prisoner to the feelings I have about him or toward him. But forgiveness doesn't mean that she would say, but I want him to be released from jail. I want him to have a pardon from jail. That's not what forgiveness is. He has a debt to society. He broke a law, and therefore he has to pay the consequences for his actions. If you have an abusive husband who hits his wife, or a man or a woman who abused children, their children, they have to pay for the consequences of those actions. You can't just simply say, well, no, I don't want him to go to jail. That's not what forgiveness is.
Forgiveness may not always be reconciliation. And that's important because many people think that forgiveness and reconciliation is the same thing. But in some of the examples you just gave, if someone has sexually abused me, I can forgive them, but I'm not going to be reconciled to them. I'm not going to put myself in the same situation with them alone again,
Or others.
because of the past abuse. Or if I have children, I'm not going to put my children in that situation. But it doesn't mean that I haven't forgiven them. It just means that I'm protecting myself from it happening again.
Forgiveness doesn't mean that you deny or that you turn a blind eye to what happened. And unfortunately, that happens sometimes, again, in abusive relationships. I have heard stories many times of, say, for instance, a father who sexually abuses his daughter. She tells mom, and mom says, no, it didn't happen. You imagine that. So she denies something that actually happened, and therefore their daughter is re-victimized, not only by the denial, but she's still allowed to, or the father is still allowed to continue to sexually abuse the child. So denying that it happened or turning a blind eye to it, that's not what forgiveness is. That's actually perpetrating the crime, if you want to say it that way.
And forgiveness is not forgetting. How could I forget something that, that really hurt me in the past? I don't have the ability to just wipe it from my memory and pretend it isn't there. So there again, we commonly hear the phrase, forgive and forget, but that is not what forgiveness is.
What you need to do is you need to forgive and forget. Well, if it was that easy, maybe God would say, well, people will just simply forget. So then just leave it at that. No, part of the problem is then when we remember what happened, then we feel guilty that we haven't forgiven, when in reality we may have forgiven. But how can we erase especially some traumatic memories out of our life? If we can remember sometimes things that happened back in our childhood, how could we forget something that happened 3 years ago or 10 years ago or 30 years ago, especially something that happened over and over, or something that cost us dearly? So to say to someone, what you need to do is just forgive and forget, it's actually making the other person feel guilty for not forgiving, which maybe they have indeed done.
Forgiveness is also not pretending that we were not hurt. We need to be honest about the hurt and communicate that this is how I felt. This is how it made me feel. So to pretend that you weren't hurt, to pretend it doesn't matter, that's not what forgiveness is.
So keep in mind, understanding what forgiveness is not, hopefully will help us to understand what forgiveness is. So forgiveness is being aware of what someone has done, but still forgiving them. There's a researcher, retired professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. His name is Dr. Everett Worthington, and he has researched on forgiveness and lectured and written on forgiveness for many, many years. And he's concluded that there are two major types of forgiveness, what he calls decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. Decisional forgiveness is when we make that decision. I forgive you. I may not feel like I forgive you at this point in time. I may still be hurt. The memories are too raw, too vivid, too painful, but I forgive you. And by forgiving, I mean I release you to God, and I release myself from the feelings that keep me attached to you. So that's decisional forgiveness. But for some, there may come a time when, again, the feelings of hatred or anger or pain actually leave, and that's when emotional forgiveness actually takes place. It doesn't take place in everyone's case or in every situation, but at least you can take decisional forgiveness as a step to release yourself from what keeps you attached, the negative feelings that keep you attached to the person that hurt you.
Forgiveness is also choosing to keep no record of wrong. If you want to keep a list of how many times you've forgiven a person, that's not really forgiving. Praise the Lord, Jesus doesn't keep a list of how many times he's forgiven me.
Yes, in fact, that's why when the disciples came to Jesus, Peter, who was the spokesperson, said to Jesus, how often should I forgive my brother? Up to 7 times? Now, keep in mind that at that time, the Jewish people required that you should forgive people up to 3 times. So Peter was not only going twice that much, but added an extra one. And I think, and I can't prove this, but I think in Peter's mind, he was probably thinking that Jesus was going to say, Peter, wow, you are awesome. Not only are you going to 3 that the people of the time, my people, the Jewish people require, you're going way above that. Man, I'm going to have you sit at the right hand of my throne here. But instead, Jesus said, no, Peter, not 7 times, 70 times 7, which those of you who are good at math, you know that it equals to 490 times. Now, what does that mean? That you could say to your spouse, okay, I have forgiven you 489 times, and so it's one more time I'm going to forgive you, and after that I'm done? Is that what Jesus meant? No, what he was saying is, why are you keeping count? Because if you're keeping tabs, if you're keeping a list of all the times that you have forgiven, then you haven't really forgiven at all. That's what Jesus was trying to say. So forgiveness is choosing to keep no record of wrong. If I forgive you, it's as if it hadn't happened. You're done. I extend to you my forgiveness. We move forward. At the same time, forgiveness is refusing to punish, because our natural inclination is to say, oh, you hurt me. I want to make sure you hurt too. In fact, not long ago, we were watching some program or show, or I forget what it was, a movie or a documentary, I don't remember what it was, where the husband committed adultery. And in return, the wife then decided she would also have an affair. So you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. No, if I extend my forgiveness, I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to do something to hurt you. I am, again, extending to you my forgiveness. Imagine if God did that. If every time that we sin, God says, well, first, before I forgive you, I'm going to punish you. We would be dead.
Forgiveness is not telling everybody else what they did. Imagine that you're going around and saying, do you know what they did? Oh, but I've forgiven them. Gossiping has no place in forgiveness.
Yes. And forgiveness means being merciful. I want you to listen to what I'm going to say, because someone explained this to me, and it's made sense to me since then, the difference between grace and forgiveness. Grace is giving someone what they don't deserve. Mercy is not giving someone what they do deserve. Let me explain it to you. Grace is giving someone what they don't deserve. God gave us his grace so that something that we don't deserve, because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We don't deserve God's grace, but yet God gives us his grace. It's his free gift. So he gives us something that we don't deserve. At the same time, what we do deserve is death, because the wages of sin is death. The punishment for sin is death. That's what we deserve. But in his mercy, he doesn't give us what we deserve. So forgiveness is the same thing. In God's grace, through us, we don't give the ones who hurt us what they deserve. Instead, we keep them away from getting what they deserve. I guess you could say it that way. Grace is giving people what they don't deserve. Mercy is not giving them what they do deserve.
And grace is to make someone free. So really, you are letting them go. You're laying them at the foot of Jesus. You're letting Jesus be their judge. You are letting go of the negative feelings. And if you think about it, I think Max Lucado said, forgiveness is setting someone free.
It's unlocking the door.
but realizing you
Or the
were the
prisoner.
prisoner. And that's really what forgiveness is, to realize, think about the alternative. The alternative to not forgiving is to hold on to all those negative feelings and think about how much that affects your own health to do that.
You're the one that's hurting. That's why someone said being resentful is like drinking a bottle of poison and expecting the other person to die. So you're the one that's hurting yourself. Forgiveness helps you, first of all. And it may help the relationship that you have with the other person. If there is no reconciliation, at least you're not hurting yourself. So that's how we protect our intimacy, by managing conflict properly. And when we do something that hurts the other person, by asking for forgiveness and by extending that forgiveness to the other person. Now, we're going to finish this series in the next session, and we'll talk more about the last part of building that house. Obviously, it's the attic and the roof. Remember that at the beginning, we talked about the foundation, but we said there's a roof that we have to talk about. Well, we'll talk about that in the next session. But for now, let's bow our heads and pray.
Dear Jesus, thank you for this opportunity today to talk about conflict management, but more importantly, to talk about forgiveness. We pray that you will help us to exhibit that grace and mercy, the same grace and mercy that you show to each of us every day. In your name I pray, amen.
Amen. God bless you.